All right, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we are going to begin. And just before I get into introductions, I want to tease what we will be talking about. So we're going to talk about, just in terms of setting some context in the stage, marketing regs that are out there, not only the GDPR and CCPA and the state laws, but those that exist more broadly. We want to talk about the GPC, the Global Privacy Control, as well as to get into discussion about cross-contextual and behavioral advertising. And then, of course, since we're going to be talking about all of the conundrums that face the teams on the line, we want to give some tips on how technology is going to be able to help. And I think the panel will agree with me as we look at the different regs that exist beyond just the two major privacy laws that sort of dominate the headlines. There's some real reasons to have marketing, legal, privacy, compliance, IT, the whole group working together. In the EU, we've got the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. So these are two new regulations that are active and in the process of being implemented, where we're looking at the idea of really taking a look at tech platforms to prevent unfair business practices, those folks that are acting as gatekeepers, the Amazons and Facebooks of the world. And then the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is the act that's actually focused in on banning targeted advertising when it comes to targeting individuals for the topics that you see here on the screen. So a lot of similarities to the topics that we're finding to be hot, especially here stateside. And of course, the e-privacy directive exists and even predated the GDPR. Certainly the GDPR complements this. It's a directive, so it doesn't carry the same weight as an actual regulation. But the e-privacy directive exists to regulate cookie usage and the ways in which businesses interact with individuals through email marketing, data minimization, and other kinds of consent-driven practices. So what we see, and this is, I think, kind of an important distinguisher, is that the e-privacy directive sort of set the context for requiring consent with cookies. And it's the GDPR that actually identified cookie identifiers as being considered personal data and falling in scope for the regulation. So you can see how the two play off of one another, and all three of these are absolutely drilled in on marketing practices. And then if we go a little bit more broadly beyond just the EU, in the UK, we've got the PECR, which regulates as well electronic marketing, including calls and text and emails. And for those of us that can't let the 90s go, faxes, to the extent anybody faxes anymore, there is a reg for that, as well as Canada's anti-spam law. And then we've got three dominant acts here in the US that exist beyond the privacy laws, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which now also has been updated to include SMS and text messaging. We've got CAN-SPAM, which is, of course, the US reg that monitors and regulates spam email. And then the FTC and the UDAP, the unfair or deceptive acts or practices. So the idea here is that marketing has never, even though it might feel sometimes as though it's the Wild West, there are a series of regulations out there that exist beyond just the privacy component in order to ensure that there is fairness, that there's transparency, that organizations are obtaining proper consent, and that notice is available. And so I don't know if anybody on the panel wanted to weigh in on any of these global regs before we spend a little time chatting also about the state regs.
Yeah, just one thing on the e-privacy directive. They've been discussing updates to that for I'm not sure how long, and they're still pending. So as much as we love the current cookie banners and whatnot, there'll be more from Europe coming down the line, and so I would not expect it to be settled anytime soon. So always more to do.
Always, and tons of attention on the cookie side from the MYOB guys. So oops, sorry about that, everybody. So definitely still a hot topic. Chet, I think you might have wanted to weigh in.
Yes, I just wanted to make everyone aware there's no sin of omission, but in the United States, while we don't have an omnibus federal privacy law, and we do have some state-specific privacy laws, there are federal laws on the books now for vertical sectors. So financial services, there's Graham Leach Bliley. Health data, there's HIPAA. And there's Cable Privacy Protection Act and the Video Privacy Protection Act and the Motor Vehicle. There's a bevy of what I call vertical sectoral specific laws. So we always, while we have a self-regulation code that actually respects those laws, we just need to make sure that in the US, even though there's might not be something that's media specific, there are some that are vertical industry specific. And I just think it's important to note that, because sometimes people think that it is not a Wild West when it probably really isn't.
Exactly. No, I think that that's a great point. And again, to sort of underpin our polling question, this is why we are looking to see organizations start to partner more closely between the different groups, because there is a lot out there and it touches on technology as well as marketing practices, as well as privacy practices. And so as if all of these federal level and country level regulations aren't enough, we do now have in the US a litany of state laws that do in fact target within their privacy acts marketing practices. So of course, up at the top, we've got the granddaddy of them all. We've got California with the CPRA amendment to the CCPA. We now have the concept of do not share my personal information in addition to the do not sell. And we see the introduction of the concept, along with Colorado, of a global opt-out signal, which is we have it in the deck here as the global privacy control. Colorado is going to opine and maybe give a couple of other mechanisms. But the idea here now is that the states are really becoming much more technology savvy and dialed in on this. We also see it in Virginia, which is requiring under their CDPA data protection assessments to be run against processing activities related to targeted advertising and profiling, as well as the sale of data. So where we didn't maybe have the teams working so closely, now we've got some really compelling reasons at the state level to see teams start to interact more. Same thing, as I mentioned, Colorado, the idea of being able to opt out of data targeting and that universal opt-out mechanism, which I think we're going to start to see a whole lot more about, and which is really sort of generating no end of confusion around within organizations. So be assured we have plenty to say on that. And then with Connecticut, we've got the same type of thing, opting out for targeting advertising for data sale and profiling, and Utah the same, the opportunity to opt out targeting advertising and selling of personal information. So I think that these states have made very clear what the dominant themes are when it comes to the way in which marketing teams within businesses are collecting, interacting with, and using personal information from individuals. So I have no doubt that the panel might want to weigh in on this. So if there's anything, please, guys, before we switch gears here, anything to add on the state level?
In the absence of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Ganesh.
Go ahead, Shed.
I was going to say, in the absence of a federal law on the books, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about all the states beyond these that are looking at some legislation. Perfect. But the point that I was going to make is that we have in the area of data breach notification, a similar situation has evolved where there's no federal standard, and now we have 50 state standards for data breach notification. We may well end up in the same state, literally, in privacy bills if a federal law does not evolve. So I think it behooves us to have a federal law with one set of standards for our country. However, in the absence of one, this is what we can expect, this type of patchwork.
Yeah. And I know you were going to say something, Ganesh, but I wanted to throw this out there because it might be something you're going to touch on. But what I find very interesting, especially as we take a look at this map, is that this is red state, blue state, purple state. We are really seeing these concepts of consumer protection, particularly related to data, to transcend party lines. And I think that that is possibly a component, which is that everybody has concerns about this. And so if we don't see the action, and potentially even if we do see the action at the federal level, it might not stop this wave at the state level.
Go ahead, Ganesh. I know you were.
Go ahead, Robert. I think you were going to add a comment regarding?
Yeah, no, just to jump in on a couple of things. One thing to keep in mind as we're all getting our heads around what it means to comply with California, Virginia, Utah later this year, is that both California and Colorado have ongoing regulatory processes, rulemaking processes that are going to layer on top of what the law itself says. And we've seen, especially in California, some of the requirements are different than what you would think would be coming out of the law itself. So making sure that you're staying on top of those processes they continue through, and not just for the differences, but for the clarity they could also offer. What is sale, what is sharing, that type of thing. And we'll talk about it a little bit with GPCs coming up. And the other point, just to, looking at this map, and this is already out of date. This was from early February. There are now more states on here. Like you said, Jalen, this isn't going away until there is a federal law that preempts all of this. And it is going to be different flavors. And all it's going to take is, so far from a kind of a risk perspective for companies, we haven't seen a private right of action go through. California's is cabined off to some data breach, unreasonable security practices. One state that puts a private right of action for having the wrong words in your privacy disclosure, having a link that's broken, and that's really going to open the floodgates of a lot more risk for companies. So it's something that everyone should be taking clear notice of. And if there are chances to get engaged with either trade groups or other organizations that can help make sure that yours are heard, is not the worst thing in the world for folks that maybe hasn't been top of mind before. It could be if some things pass.
Very good points.
I wanted to add that in addition to global opt-out that CPRA is talking about, CPRA is also mandating, recognizing global opt-outs or just the latest consent across devices for known users. What that means is if the user is known to a business, then no matter which device the consumer is using to access that business website, the latest preference for that particular user must be applied across all those devices. So things like these are coming up. These we hadn't heard before.
Absolutely. And another good point to underscore why we really need to see collaboration between technology teams, marketing teams, and the privacy legal teams that are managing and monitoring these kinds of regs and requirements. All right, so we have set the stage. We have given everybody heart palpitations. To the team, here is the open question. Again, the impact of the GPC on marketing teams, on privacy teams, on organizations broadly.
Yeah, I
So
guess
I'm not sure.
I'll jump in first, and I think it's going to be from a legal standpoint, right? It's I helped put this slide together, and it's the most wordy one on here because lawyers love to just use lots of words. But it's understanding from your legal team, what do you need to comply with, and then it's working with folks like TrustArc and others in the marketplace that can help you figure out how you can do that from a technical standpoint. So from baseline, it's just going to be one more thing you have to include in your checklist of, are we doing what we need to be doing? And the problem, and the reason to call someone like me, is it's going to mean different things in different states, and that's part of what we have here. Is in Colorado, they call them UMs, universal opt-out mechanisms, which applies to targeted advertising and sale of personal data. But in California, it's an opt-out preference signal, and they decided through a tweet from the outgoing Attorney General to endorse one called the Global Privacy Control. That now is, when we talk about GPCs, and Ganesh, maybe you summed up, it's not just one thing. It's going to be a suite of things, and the question is going to be which one of those has the actual legal effect that I need to do, and which one of those maybe don't. How do I want to deal with that from a compliance standpoint?
Yeah, so global privacy control is a signal that is set by the consumer on their browser that signals to every business or every website that they visit that signal must be honored, and they cannot, the consumer wants to opt out of tracking technologies or selling of their personal data. Marketing teams and privacy teams need to definitely consider this. right? When a consumer comes to the website, businesses need to see whether the GPC, this global opt-out is set, and if it is, then need to opt them out of all the things we just talked about. In addition, if the user is known and if there is a financial incentive program that the user is enrolled in, then they would have to ask the user whether they would want to opt out of the financial incentive programs as well. So there is a little bit complexity to it based on whether the user is known to the businesses or whether the user is not known, and if the user is known, whether that particular user is involved in a financial incentive program for the business.
And I actually have a question for the panel. And on that note, I just want to take a brief moment to remind the audience, please, we welcome any questions that you have. Use the GoToMeeting module over on the right-hand side of your screen. Send us your questions. We will do our very best to answer them during the presentation. So don't be shy about that. But I have a question to Robert, to Ganesh, to Chet about the GPC and just this concept of universal opt-out. The way that this appears is that it takes state level opting out of sale, because I know that I've actually tried to opt out of the sale of my personal data, and some businesses do actually have state level gatekeeping where they want to validate that I am and I'm not from California, so they respectfully declined my request. It seems as though this preference signal would almost make it extraterritorial from the state level, where anywhere, and if you have this set because the states allow for it, does that mean that I, from a state that might not have do not sell and do not share, get to actually back into the ability to prevent that from happening?
I don't know if there's an answer from a technical side, and then there's the answer from the policy side. And I think, as you've seen, John, right, some companies take the view that we're just it's easier for us to just do this wherever. Colorado or California passed the law. It's not a big enough impact on our business to go state by state and do that. But that is an option. Even with these, they're called universal opt-out mechanisms or global privacy controls, but the only place they have legal effect, other than, if you said we're going to honor these things, is in these states. So it's an option for companies, but it's hard to do. And I'm sure, Ganesh maybe has ideas for how people can do that. But that, I think, from a policy side of things, it's going to be a company by company basis, and it's really going to come down to how hard is it to do. If we give this to everybody, does my business go away? That type of thing.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Today, consumers really are not using this global opt-outs signal as much. The policy is definitely ahead in this particular case. So I think for businesses, it may be easier to recognize it across all the states, right? Even though just the Colorado or California mandates it. But I believe that as more and more consumers start using this particular global opt-out, businesses may say, hey, look, I'm only going to honor this in Colorado and California because I don't want to lose you or lose the ability to kind of like to, not opt you out. And then, so I think it is probably in this particular case numbers game.
Interesting. All right, and since we do have a fair bit of participants on the webinar today who don't really feel that their organization is primed and ready to address this as it starts to come up, does the panel have any tips for teams as they start to prepare themselves to get ready to deal with universal opt-out and the preference signal situation? Any gems of wisdom that we can impart in terms of preparing?
Well, I think one thing we've already heard, if you can't geofence your customers somehow, then you're almost in a state of risk to take the California, Colorado Kool-Aid and drink it. And so, you have to make that decision. Obviously, too, you're going to have California residents who are traveling to other states, and they're still subject to California law no matter where they are. So you're going to have that small risk, but it can happen, so it needs to be understood. I'm always glad when Robert leans in and says, but Colorado and California are still promulgating. So stay tuned. There may be some devils in details that we've yet to learn, and who knows, it could come from a tweet. So just be careful.
Very good.
Talking about the technical solution itself, Chad, you're right. It's absolutely not possible to 100% say that this particular California resident is a person coming from California or coming from, say, some other state is not a California resident, right? By geolocation, it's not that perfect. But that said, today in our solutions, we do allow to recognize GPC based on states. Our customers can say, hey, I want to recognize this only in Colorado and California using geolocation, or say, I want to do it in more than these states. So they have a granular control over which state or which country, whatever they want to do.
Yeah, and I think this will lead into our next topic too, but taking full stock of what you do with data. The definition of sale is much broader in all of these, but particularly California. So if you're a company that's not necessarily packaging a bunch of data and saying, give me $100 and here's a set of data, you still might be engaged in sale. So these things might apply to you even if you don't necessarily think this is what you do on the face of it. And then I think going to our next topic, do you engage in the other types of things other than sale? Profiling, which is defined specifically. So just because you might build a consumer profile doesn't mean you're engaged in profiling under the state laws, because it depends on what you do with that, how you use it. And then what the type of advertising you engage in. Are you engaged in cross-contextual or behavioral advertising? They're slightly different. We'll talk about that. But also, are you the company that needs to comply with that? Are you the one engaged in the collection and use of data? Or are you the one that is letting that happen on your property? And that can go into some, beyond all this, the self-regulatory, the DAA requirements for it that can check and talk about later. So taking that inventory and taking stock is important. And again, it goes back to our theme. You have to talk to each other. Because marketing is you do one thing. Ganesh has mentioned it a couple of times. Do you know who your consumer is? Maybe the tech team thinks of people as cookies and identifiers, but the marketing team knows they can link those to an email address, and all of a sudden you've got different requirements. So making sure everyone understands where your data is and how it's being used is, I think, that's the baseline, whether you're going to comply with GPC or not.
Excellent. So really fantastic takeaways, which is to really have a clear understanding of what is happening now, understanding what marketing is doing, and keeping an eye on the near term, what marketing wants to do. It sounds like also taking into consideration how technology can enable your business to more effectively contend with these varying requirements across states, or if you're going to actually implement a global preference globally. And then most importantly is to really understand strategically from a compliance perspective what you want to do. So to Chet's point, do you want to try to geofence? Are you going to allow it to be something that's available to everyone? So definitely some food for thought for everyone there. We can really now start to get into, again, some of the nuts and bolts in terms of how digital marketing winds up doing what it does. So take it away. I'm not sure who wants to begin on this one.
I'll start off just with, again, all of the words. So I think it's again important to understand the differences of what we talk about, because in the marketplace, in our industries, we talk about targeted advertising, OBA, cross context, kind of as interchangeably the same thing. But when it comes down to applying the law, it really matters what it says. So, and I'll just quickly pull out the distinction here. In California, cross-contextual behavioral advertising is the targeting of an ad based on data about activity between two businesses, between one business and another business. In Virginia, and similar to DAs, although not exactly the same, targeted advertising is selecting advertising based on collection of data over time and across non-affiliated online applications. So California's could be read as being a little bit broader. I'm not necessarily collecting, it's not necessarily limited to non-affiliated online websites. It could be offline data combined across two different companies. Virginia is really cabined to what it says there, and the DAA is just for kind of where all this comes from. This isn't new. We've been all doing this for well over a decade in the market, right? It's the collection of data from a computer or device over time and across those non-affiliated properties to infer and deliver an ad based on those inferences. So all similar flavors of it, but really when you think about how your company needs to comply, what these regulations mean, you need to make sure whether you're doing one or the other. And again, whether you're the company that's doing one or the other, if you've hired somebody to do it on your behalf.
And so in terms of for businesses, what are some of the challenges? I don't know if the panel wants to weigh in on, to me, it sounds as though one of the first steps would be making sure that there is internal consensus on whether or not this is happening. We do have some maybes in the audience, and I would imagine that that might be more common across a broader spectrum than even represented here, because maybe legal and marketing haven't been paying too much attention to what one another are doing as it relates to this, and now that it falls into regulations. So other than opening up the conversation and finding out what's happening, what other kinds of things should businesses be thinking about when it comes to an approach to dealing with these new requirements around the OBA or cross-contextual advertising?
Well, I think on the start of it, with online behavioral advertising, we make a distinction between that, a DAA, and contextual advertising, which is based on the content on sites and having subject matter be the definitive targeting mechanism rather than the behavior of a websites visited or apps used on a device. So that's an important distinction to make. Some companies may opt for contextual as an alternative to behavioral, but you have to test. I mean, I come from the world where, hello, you're in digital advertising. Why are you not using data for targeting, attribution, and measurement? And yes, we do branding on digital too, but certainly we have the ability to be much more efficient than a traditional print or broadcast model, although broadcast with addressable television, that's changing. So I just wanted to make it known that you just need to understand where your data is in your another caution I wanted to make sure is people think first party data, oh, we only use first party data. Oh, really? So take a look. Are you making sure you're not appending your first party data with third party data to make a more whole picture of your customer or prospect? So those things are important because in the digital environment, that's why programmatic advertising exists, to help you build that customer base. You're not just reaching your customers, you use third party data to grow your customer base, while you may use first party data to grow your existing customers. So the important role, one of our roles in speaking to legislators, is to make sure they understand the importance of consumer discovery in third-party data. And so, yeah, we definitely offer the roadmaps to using that third-party data responsibly and making sure that the state laws that do pass enables that discovery to continue to happen. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, Chet, this is incredibly helpful. Does anyone else in the panel have anything that they want to add? All righty. In that case, I'm going to, because I think that this also sets up nicely for our next topic, which is about consent. And so this is not a polling question, but one of the things that we wanted teams on the phone to sort of put into the back of their head is thinking about how you are or how you should be handling consent in order to maintain efficiency in marketing, but also at the same time, how to be compliant with the regulations. And so I know, Ganesh, that you had some thoughts that you wanted to share with us on this topic.
Yeah, it's very important to know what consumers are consenting for which processing purposes they give you their consent for, right? And then use their data only for those purposes and not for anything else. Here we are talking about, I think there's a point here about consent and preferences. So understanding what is a consent and what is a preference is also important. Consent is basically a permission, right? Consumer is giving permission, for example, maybe to send them emails or to use their data for a particular purpose or to receive SMS text messages, etc. preference is just a choice they are making. For example, what time of the day they may be called, right? So that's a distinction that we also want to that the businesses should also remember. And regarding applying these consents, we already talked about remembering for what purposes those consents were gathered, and whether that while gathering the consent, did businesses tell the consumer that, hey, I'm gathering this piece of data for these purposes, and this is how we are going to use this information, etc. And then based on the regulations in some places, in some jurisdictions, it could be an explicit opt-in to use by consumers to use their data, right? But in some other regulations, it may be an implicit opt-in as long as there's a reasonable doubt that consumers will be interested in this particular say marketing emails or communication, but there should be an explicit opt-out, right? And then also in some regulations may say that you cannot the look and feel of the form itself where you're gathering this consent should be uniform towards either of the choices. And then basically, if you say opt-in and opt-out using buttons, both of those buttons look the same, you haven't pre-selected any of them, the colors are the same, the fonts are the same, the sizes are the same, things like those, right? And then also some of the regulations may say, hey, you cannot pre-tick a box for say opt-in and make that decision for you, and then only allow your consumer to click the submit. So there are a lot of things like these that our businesses have to remember. Double opt-in that you're talking about, you have here, Janelyn, on this slide is also a good one. It's not very prevalent, but in Germany and in certain parts of EU, it is there. So basically, the idea here is when a consumer opts in, then their choices are sent to them over email, and then they have to again confirm it by clicking the link, looking at the opt-ins, and then clicking submit again or confirm again, right? So that double opt-in, whether the double opt-in is a regulation in the jurisdiction where the business is operating, knowing these things are important as well. So in general, I think if we step back from all this, what we are saying is understand where you're doing business and understand what kind of data you are storing for what purposes, and then understand the jurisdiction, the regulations in those jurisdictions, and then what they say about gathering consent and how to gather consent.
Excellent. And I think we have a little screenshot of it up here. I think the granularity is something that can't be emphasized enough. One, we see it written into the regulations where we want to have unambiguous and freely given and very specific consent given. But I know that marketing teams are very concerned about maintaining their lists, about making sure that there's an audience and that they're able to reach people. And if we think about the granularity component, it may actually create much more effective lists, because now we're actually being able to target individuals at their request for topics that they're specifically interested in. And so where initially folks wanted to, we had just an opt-in or opt-out or completely unsubscribe me, having the granularity allows you to potentially keep certain targets or customers because they want to know about some components of your business, but maybe not all of them universally. So a little something to think about in terms of soothing some of the ruffled feathers about the fact that now the privacy and regulatory compliance team is going to come into marketing and make sure that when we're working with these lists that they're updated and that the consent is current, and that most importantly, to Ganesh's point, you have the ability to check the box and then uncheck the box so that you can both give and revoke that consent. Before we move on to the next topic, I don't know if anyone on the panel had anything that they wanted to add with respect to consent or lead gen or opting or double even opting in.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say is earlier we had a poll question about how often the privacy and the marketing teams work together, and this is where I feel that working together is very, very important, right? Because privacy team understands all these regulations and then what needs to be done, and then it may be in most of the cases marketing team that creates and then publishes these consent forms and then make it look like their brand pages or whatever that is. So working together is super important in this particular case.
It's also respectful of consumers. People are mostly privacy pragmatic. They don't want the nuclear opt-out option, which is one of my challenges with the GPC, because sometimes they back into that, not realizing what they've done. But having a preference center really puts forward our ability to curate a better user experience for consumers online and give them what they want. The only tech issue I would add is make sure you're time date stamping every consent you get, and even if you possibly documenting the methodology given for that consent. I think that will be helpful as consumers gain data access rights.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Chad. On top of it, where it was given, how it was given, what it was given, how did the form look like when the consent was given, and then basically, maintaining all those details in case of downstream consumer comes back and then says, hey, I don't think I gave you consent. So to be able to prove that, you would have to have all those data.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a fantastic segue to take us into our next topic, because reporting, audit trail, tracking, all those things are absolutely critical. And this is a surefire area in which technology can help, even beyond and in addition to the things that we've already been talking about. So with the 15 minutes or so that we've got remaining, I want to change gears a little bit and start to talk tactically. So Ganesh, why don't you lead us off here?
Yeah, so let me quickly talk about these three solutions we have on this slide. Consent and Preference Manager allows businesses to gather consents such as marketing consents for known users and then store it in a centralized location on a server and then use it wherever it needs to be used. For example, while gathering marketing consents, such as, you can send me email on this particular email for this purposes. You can SMS text me on this particular number for this purposes. The consents gathered for those things will have to be stored in a centralized location and then sent to all the email applications that are sending out these emails, or SMS sending applications, right? So that is what Consent and Preference Manager does. It stores the consent in a centralized location for known users and then distributes it to all the downstream systems that need to be aware of these consents. And Individual Rights Manager is a data subject request solution. Basically, this allows data subjects to create data subject requests, and some of those data subject requests could be consent related, such as do not sell or share my information or opt out, right? So the DSRs created would also have to flow to rest of the systems within a business's network, so that these systems understand what consumer said. And Cookie Consent Manager, of course, gathers consent for tracking technologies or third-party solutions or apps that are embedded on websites, right? So these three solutions together help businesses to maintain compliance when it comes to gathering consent. And more we see that these solutions are interworking and then coming together as one solution.
Definitely a holistic environment. And I think that the technology also is a really great segue into some feedback from the DAA team in terms of the things that they're focused on in terms of privacy, the concepts of self-regulation. So we know what the challenges are. We know that we've got a technology ecosystem that can help businesses start to manage. And then now we can get some opinions from the experts in terms of even more advanced concepts like self-regulatory principles and other kinds of ways in which to manage your compliance.
Hey, thank you, Jaylin. I wanted everyone to know this URL on the screen. Why? Because even if you think of privacy as just a legal compliance mechanism, you're selling yourself short. You should start with the self-regulation principles that are in effect, whether or not there is legal compliance. There is enforceable self-regulation principles in the United States and elsewhere under the DAA framework. We've tackled the issues of online behavioral or interest-based advertising, multi-site data, which talks about some of the sensitive data categories which have popped up in Europe, and restrictions there where opt-in may be necessary. We talk about the mobile environment and certainly the political ad environment. And the new one thing I loved about the TrustArc slide with the cookie consent manager, a lot of addressable media identifiers are evolving beyond cookies. So we're looking at things like hashed emails, hashed phone numbers, beyond mobile ad IDs and cookies, and how companies use those AMIs need to be done in a privacy conscious way. And we're looking to help do the heavy lifting there. And we're also working always, our principals committee is working on what's next, Internet of Things, connected devices, precise location data. These things are also why you need to keep an eye very closely on what DAA is up to. One of the next slide, if you could, is how we bring forward into consent management platforms ad choices, real-time privacy controls. So TrustArc is one of those companies that helps, not only do they help companies with all those principles we just showed, they help companies in their consent management platform solution to bring this ad choices control to the forefront of the consumer. The consumer 80% of consumers in the US know that ad choices icon. They know it's a link to privacy controls. So we ask brands and publishers who raise their hand and make sure they're using it in their consent management platforms. The next slide. We're also, just as you showed that lovely consent platform for preference centers, we too are looking to build subject matter opt-outs. Instead of a nuclear opt-out, you have an opt-down based on based on subject matter categories. So we are now testing that. We're getting some great feedback and on both the categories and consumers' desire to use this type of opt-down versus an opt-out. And a lot of this is based on feedback given to us from consumers over the years. So I think it's something to keep note. We'll be announcing it being full force probably mid-year this year.
And I think on this slide, Chad, it's so wonderful. I like the granularity in the screenshot because it does, for those of us that are not even armchair marketing team members, it does demystify some of the black box component because it is a little bit confusing. Even if you are technical, you might not really understand exactly what happens as you interact with digital properties because the technology just continues to grow in leaps and bounds. And so having the opportunity to engage at this granular level, I would imagine, is incredibly powerful for marketing teams.
It resonates with consumers too.
Yeah.
I mean, when you go to our opt-out tools now, you may see companies that you don't recognize who they are in the ad tech ecosystem. Yeah. This brings it home to where consumers really see what advertisers and the digital ad ecosystem is trying to do. It's trying to create a customer in a relevant way. That's all we're trying to do. But you have the opportunity to say no, thank you. Exactly. Next slide. And I mentioned this just a moment ago. TrustArc is our certifier. So if you're a company who is creating identity graphs for the marketplace, you have an identity solutions for the marketplace, DAA will work with TrustArc to get a certification for you that looks at the privacy by design, privacy conscious effort you undertake to protect your identity graph. All the data sources are audited and made sure that they are the data collected and applied to an identity graph is done in a compliant way to DAA principles and including legal conscripts. So I wanted to just make sure that brands and publishers on this call look for certified, and maybe the next slide is a good way to look at, look for certified AMIs in the marketplace. Put them in your contracts, put them in your RFPs, put them in your proposals, that you want to work with an identity provider who is using a DAA certified identity solution. Why that matters is, again, trying to make sure that the consumer's choice as they opt out, they're understanding that they're doing so in a way that not just opts them out of a particular ad tech platform or category, but also identity solutions that are applied in the marketplace.
Excellent. Thanks, Chad. I don't know, Robert, Ganesh, if you guys had anything to add. We have a few minutes here for some either discussion questions, for some closing thoughts, for anything that we wanted to sort of piggyback or add to what we've already talked about this afternoon so far.
Yeah, there was one question, Janelyn, a bit of a comment, but maybe there's more to add on this. Some companies may think they don't sell or share, but they don't realize that some of their cookies on their websites will actually trip them up on this. I mean, anything else to add on there?
Ganesh is smiling. I'll just say, I think that, I mean, it's right. And it goes back to that, make sure you know what you're doing. And just because, and you know, we've seen it in some of the enforcement work from that, well, we don't do those, we don't do anything like that, we don't do anything like that. And then, you know, we talk to our client and say, well, I clicked on the you know, the Chrome link that shows me what cookies are on your website, and you have 50 companies on there. Oh, well, we didn't know. We're not saying that that's going to make you into someone that needs to comply with the law, but that's where you're going to run into those problems.
So it all comes back down to one of our earliest questions, which is how frequently are different teams inside the organization collaborating? And that, to me, I think, Robert, your point underscores all of that, which is understand what's happening, not only from a strategy perspective, but also from an actual technical, what is happening on your website, and making sure that for the teams that are writing policies, that are writing notices, that you actually understand what these technologies are doing. And then to the slide that Ganesh had earlier, making sure that you've got that ecosystem built. It doesn't appear to me that there is a solution that can exist in a vacuum. You need to have consent and preference management. You need to have that linked and interacting with the DSAR so that you have the ability to respond when folks have questions. Not only do you track what it is that they've given you consent for, but if they want to know, you have the ability to respond. And then, of course, underpinning that is the oh so visible cookie component, which is something that you know, continues to be ubiquitous and also bedevil organizations when it comes to how to appropriately comply, which I think is one of, you know, basically what we just spoke about. All right, I will go around the horn to give everyone a chance with our final 2 minutes for some closing thoughts. And while I do that, I will scroll forward to the final slide that has some information for contacting us. Oh, there is, yeah. So Robert, why don't you start us off with some closing thoughts?
Thanks. It was great conversation, great discussion. Thanks for having me on to participate. I think one thing I'll close with is, and it goes back to both Ganesh and Chet were saying, if you're going to tell a consumer something, make sure you honor what you tell them. Because we talked a lot about opt-outs and opt-ins, and you know, whether it's legally compliant one way or the other. The thing that will trip up a lot of organizations is, oh, we said we don't do this because it sounded good to the consumer. That's great, and I understand you want to build a trust with the consumer, but you build trust by telling them the truth. Because if it turns out that you didn't do that, or you slightly changed what you did and didn't tell them, that's what gets you on the hook for legal compliance under that what we talked about earlier, the FTC, the UDAP statutes. Because if you don't honor what you say, then you get into problem. So make sure you're honoring all of that.
Absolutely. Chet.
Hey, thank you. I would say if you walk into privacy with a compliance mentality, you're doing yourself a disservice. If you walk into privacy with a principled mentality, you are doing yourself, your brand, a great lift. So I would just try to wear your compliance hat, but wear your principled hat too. Encourage your teams to be principled approach to how they handle data, and you'll actually do a lot of the right things without even looking at what a law says. That being said, yes, we have to read what the promulgations are. We have to understand what the expectations are of lawmakers and regulators. But I like to go back to what the expectations of the consumer are. And just being respectful gets you a long, long way.
Excellent. And Ganesh, final thoughts.
Thank you for having me on this webinar. My closing thoughts is that work with your privacy team, marketing team, IT teams, whoever internally or externally, in case of like vendors or maybe you're buying or selling consumer data, work with all of them to be able to comply with these regulations.
Excellent. Well, from all of us, thank you all for participating today. The panel, thank you for attending. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to use the URL or the email that you see on your screen. And with that, I will again extend a very warm thank you to my panel for being so fascinating this afternoon. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.